The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, some of the most expensive and advanced aircraft carriers the world had ever seen. They revolutionized naval warfare, shifting the focus from battleships to carrier-based air power. Carriers provided the platform for launching attacks, supporting ground troops, and controlling sea lanes. The dominators of the sea, allowing for total control in the Pacific and some of Imperial Japan's primary targets for the attacks on Pearl Harbor. However, these ships were not there. Hello, and welcome to Deadliest Disasters. The seeds of Pearl Harbor were planted years before the first Japanese Zero fighter appeared over Oahu. Japan's aggressive expansion into China beginning in 1937 had already strained relations with the United States, which viewed Japanese imperialism as a threat to its own interest in the Pacific and to the principle of the open door policy in China. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937, marked the beginning of what would become Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a euphemistic term for Japanese domination of the Pacific region. American opposition to Japanese expansion manifested initially through economic pressure rather than military action. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was constrained by strong isolationist sentiment in Congress and among the American public, who had no desire to become entangled in another foreign war so soon after World War I. However, as Japanese forces committed increasingly brutal atrocities in China, most notably the rape of Nanking in December 1937, where Japanese soldiers murdered an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, American public opinion began to shift. The Roosevelt administration responded with a series of escalating economic sanctions designed to pressure Japan into withdrawing from China. In July 1939, the United States terminated its commercial treaty with Japan, signaling its intent to restrict trade. This was followed by incremental embargoes on strategic materials, beginning with aviation fuel and scrap metal in 1940. The most devastating blow came in July 1941, when Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States and imposed a complete oil embargo, a move that would force Japan to either abandon its expansionist ambitions or find alternative sources of oil within approximately 18 months before its strategic reserves were exhausted. The European dimension of the conflict further complicated matters. Japan's signing of the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in September 1940 aligned it formally with America's enemies in Europe. This alliance meant that any conflict with Japan would likely draw America into the European theater as well, a prospect that both sides understood clearly. Against this backdrop of increasing hostility, both nations made genuine efforts to avoid war through diplomatic negotiation. From March through November 1941, Japanese ambassadors met regularly with the Secretary of State in Washington, attempting to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. These meetings represented the last hope for preventing war in the Pacific. The Japanese position, as articulated through these negotiations, centered on several key demands that they considered essential to their national survival. First and foremost, Japan insisted that the United States end its economic sanctions and resume normal trade relations, particularly the export of oil and other strategic materials. Without access to American petroleum, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within months, making this demand non-negotiable from the Japanese perspective. Second, Tokyo demanded that Washington cease its material support for Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces in China. American aid to China was helping sustain Chinese resistance to the Japanese occupation. From Japan's viewpoint, continued American support for China represented direct interference in what they considered their legitimate sphere of influence. Third, and perhaps most ambitiously, Japan sought American recognition of its right to access the natural resources of the Dutch East Indies, which is now modern-day Indonesia. With the Netherlands occupied by Germany and the Dutch colonial government in exile, Japan argued that it should be allowed to secure the oil, rubber, and other strategic materials of the region that were essential to its industrial economy. This demand essentially asked the United States to acquiesce to Japanese expansion into Southeast Asia, something that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific. The American position, articulated primarily by Secretary Hull, provided equally inflexible. The Hull Note, delivered to the Japanese ambassadors on November 26, 1941, represented the final American offer and effectively ended any hope of peaceful resolution. The note demanded that Japan withdraw all military forces from China and French Indochina, abandon the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, and recognize only the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek in China. In exchange, the United States would resume normal trade relations and unfreeze Japanese assets. The Japanese regarded the note as a demand for unconditional surrender of everything they had fought for over the previous 4 years in China. The Hull Note essentially asked Japan to abandon its entire Pacific Empire and strategic position, returning to the status quo of pre-1937. For a nation that had invested tremendous blood and treasure in its expansion, and which viewed access to natural resources as essential to its survival as a modern industrial power, such terms were utterly unacceptable. The negotiations were further complicated by mutual mistrust and cultural misunderstandings. American negotiators, including Hull, viewed Japanese diplomacy with suspicion, particularly given Japan's history of launching attacks without formal declarations of war, as had occurred in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905 and the attack on China in 1937. Japanese negotiators, meanwhile, believed that the United States was negotiating in bad faith, using diplomacy as a cover while secretly preparing for war. Intelligence intercepts added another layer of complexity to the negotiations. The United States had broken several Japanese diplomatic codes through the MAGIC program, allowing American officials to read many Japanese diplomatic communications in real time. This intelligence revealed that Japan was simultaneously preparing for war while negotiating for peace, but it also showed that many Japanese diplomats genuinely hoped to avoid conflict. Perhaps no aspect of Pearl Harbor has generated more controversy and conspiracy theories than the question of whether President Roosevelt and other senior American officials had advanced knowledge of the impending attack on Pearl Harbor. These theories range from claims that Roosevelt deliberately provoked the attack to serve his own political ends, to allegations that he possessed specific intelligence about the timing and target of the Japanese strike, but chose not to act in order to ensure American entry into World War II. The most persistent conspiracy theory suggests that Roosevelt deliberately maneuvered Japan into attacking Pearl Harbor to provide the political justification he needed to bring the United States into World War II. Proponents of this theory point to several pieces of circumstantial evidence. First, they note that Roosevelt had believed that American entry into the war was necessary to prevent Nazi victory in Europe. The attack on Pearl Harbor provided the incident needed to overcome isolationist sentiment and unite the American people behind the war effort. The second conspiracy points to the absence of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The USS Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The USS Lexington was en route to Midway Island on a similar mission, and the USS Saratoga was in port on the West Coast undergoing repairs. These were the most valuable ships in the Pacific Fleet, and their absence from Pearl Harbor meant they survived to play crucial roles in the subsequent Pacific campaign. Some say this was not coincidental, but rather evidence that senior officials knew of the impending attack and took steps to protect the most important assets while allowing the less critical battleships and personnel to be sacrificed. The missing ships theory extends beyond just the aircraft carriers. Several modern cruisers and destroyers were also absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7th, either on patrol duty or conducting training exercises. The pattern of absences suggests foreknowledge at the highest levels of the Navy and Roosevelt administration. Intelligence intercepts provide another source of conspiracy theories. The MAGIC program had broken Japanese diplomatic codes, and American intelligence was reading many Japanese communications in real time. In the weeks leading up to Pearl Harbor, these intercepts showed clear Japanese preparations for war, including instructions to diplomatic posts to destroy code books and other sensitive materials. On December 6, 1941, American intelligence intercepted the first of 13 parts of what would become Japan's formal rejection of the whole note, with the 14th part arriving early on December 7th. This final part instructed Japanese diplomats to deliver the note at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time, just 30 minutes before the attack began. The timing of this message should have been a clear warning that an attack was imminent, and that the Pacific timing suggested a coordinated military action. Several senior officials, including Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark and Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, were oddly absent or unreachable during the crucial hours of December 7th, when warnings could have been sent to Pearl Harbor. But some argue these claims might not all be accurate. First, while Roosevelt certainly supported American entry into the war, there is no credible evidence that he possessed specific knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack. The intelligence available to Washington, while indicating Japanese preparations for war, consistently pointed towards Southeast Asia as a likely target, not Hawaii. Japanese forces were already moving toward the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and the Philippines, and American intelligence assessments concluded that these were the most likely targets of Japanese aggression. Second, the absence of aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor can be explained by legitimate operational requirements rather than conspiracy. The carriers were engaged in routine missions to reinforce American island bases in the Pacific, missions that had been planned weeks in advance and were part of normal military operations. The fact that these missions saved the carriers was fortunate, but not necessarily evidence of foreknowledge. Third, while American intelligence had broken Japanese diplomatic codes, they had not penetrated Japanese naval codes, which would have revealed the specific plans for the Pearl Harbor attack. The intelligence available to Washington showed Japanese diplomatic and political preparations for war, but did not reveal operational military planning. The famous "wins" message, which conspiracy theorists claim was a coded warning of the attack, may or may not have ever existed. The most compelling evidence against the conspiracy theories comes from the Japanese side. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officials, including Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, revealed that the operation was conceived and planned in absolute secrecy, with knowledge limited to a very small circle of senior Japanese naval officers. Even most Japanese government officials were not informed of the specific plans until shortly before the attack. If the Japanese maintained such strict operational security, it seems unlikely that American intelligence could have penetrated it. Regardless if American personnel knew of the impending attack, the results were brutal. The Japanese attacked with 353 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers in 2 waves launched from 6 aircraft carriers. Of the 8 U.S. battleships present, all were damaged and 4 were sunk. All but Arizona were later raised and 6 were returned to service during the war. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and a mine layer. More than 180 U.S. aircraft were also destroyed. A total of 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,178 others were wounded, while the Japanese only lost a total of 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 130 men. Japan declared war on the U.S. and the British Empire later that day. On December 8th, both the United Kingdom and U.S. declared war on Japan. On December 11th, though they had no formal obligation to do so under the Tripartite Pact with Japan, Germany and Italy each declared war on the United States. More than 8 decades after the attack, Pearl Harbor remains a defining moment in American history, a symbol of both American vulnerability and American resilience. The conspiracy theories that surround the attack reflect not just the historical curiosity, but also deeper questions about the nature of American democracy, the relationship between government and citizens, and the costs of global leadership. The debate over what Roosevelt knew and when he knew it is unlikely ever to be definitively resolved. The historical record suggests that while American leaders expected war with Japan, they did not possess specific knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack. The intelligence failures that made the attack possible were the result of institutional problems, communication breakdowns, and analytical errors rather than deliberate deception. What is certain is that Pearl Harbor transformed both America and the world in ways that continue to resonate today. The attack that was intended to secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific instead ensured American hegemony for generations. The surprise attack that was meant to demoralize America instead galvanized a sleeping giant that would ultimately reshape the global order. The men who died at Pearl Harbor, sailors trapped in the overturned hull of the Oklahoma, airmen killed at their breakfast table at Hickam Field, civilians struck down by falling shrapnel in Honolulu, paid the ultimate price for the failures of diplomacy and the miscalculations of leaders on both sides of the Pacific. Their sacrifice was not in vain, but it came at the cost that both nations are still paying today. Thank you all for tuning in. Please like and subscribe, and let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover. This has been Deadliest Disasters.